All right, Shabbosai, good morning. Good morning. Let us begin by thanking all of our sponsors for this morning's shir to thank our annual Talmud Torah sponsor. Our annual Talmud Torah sponsor. Hashem, it's so beautiful. Like, who would think at such an early time in the morning you'd have to talk over people? It's like such a schus. Baruch Hashem, to have such a rash in the base range. It's beautiful. Okay, so begin by thanking our annual Talmud Torah sponsor, Tosim Shvach Avaris Yisrael, for dedicating all the Shir and Drashos this year as a zechus for Besoros Tovos for Am Yisrael. Our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Tammuz, Haba Alim Latova, Aaron and Alana Weinberg, and thanks to Hashem for all of his nisim, both the revealed and the hidden, for the miracle of Yonatan Shai Weinberg 14 years ago, for Besoros Tovos for Am Yisrael and Eretz Yisrael, and the merit of the speedy arrival of Mashiach, Mihira B'Yameinu. Amen. Daniel Batsheva Pava of Eretz Yisrael, in permission of the second year of Batsheva's father, Rabbi Shlomo ben Yehuda Aryeh Vei, Zichron Livracha, Philadelphia, which on the 7th of Tammuz, a child survivor of Auschwitz, was zocha to leave over 100 descendants before he left this world. Our week of learning sponsors, Binyamin Fleischman, in memory of Rav Shmuel Yudel ben Binyamin Yaakov, Zichron Livracha, and our week of learning sponsors, Mr. and Mrs. Shalom Rosenblum, in commemoration of the Rebbe's Yartzeit. You see, a little public shaming does a lot of good, which was yesterday on Gimel Tammuz, and Hashem. You know, one could say the Rebbe's neshama shav and aliyah, but that his neshama is in the highest of high. That's obvious. But more importantly, that Amir Hashem, that his legacy and his life's work should continue to inspire us to become better people and better shluchei Hashem. Amir Hashem is the greatest azchus we can give him. So also we hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, all the neshama shav and aliyah, the families in Nechama, all of those who need refuah shav and together the kol chol Yisrael, Kadosh Baruch Hu Shemir Hashem, bring home all of our hostages b'shalom and b'karav. Allow our holy soldiers to be successful. B'chol ma'asei yedehem. And Amir Hashem, shower our brothers and sisters in Eretz Yisrael with Shmir Yisera, Hashkacha Pratis, and Amir Hashem, Shalom. We'll say with that, let us begin with a beautiful, beautiful daf ahead of us today, getting a little bit back into some of the interesting halachas concerning Avoda Zara. We'll say, so I just also want to mention, a number of you asked me after the shir yesterday that, like, practically, what do we do with a lot of these halachas today? Like, what do we do with this? Like, what's the takeaway? Samir Hashem, when we get a little bit further in, not all of Avoda Zara is actually about Avoda Zara, like most Masechtas. Samir Hashem, kind of once we round out the actual Avoda Zara sugyas, we'll go a little bit more contemporary, as there are a number of simanim in Shulchan Aruch. A number of simanim in Shulchan Aruch. I'll just tell you, just so you should know, I think for not one of the first times, but 2 weeks ago, I had a plethora of Avoda Zara, potential Avoda Zara shaylos. Why? A number of people who were headed to Eretz Yisrael were stranded in Rome. Well, when in Rome, not just simply do as the Romans do, but when in Rome, there's a lot to do, like a lot of tourist sites, but of course, a lot of them are associated with the church. So a lot of very interesting shaylos come up, and actually a number of museums are, technically speaking, like the Sistine Chapel is actually, there's a museum that's part of Vatican City that's there, and seeing the artwork. So a lot of just interesting shaylos that come up, which Amir Hashem, as we get a little bit more into the sugyas, we'll talk about. But again, just to point out, there is some fascinating halachas associated with all of this, so we'll get there. So we'll say with that, today's daf is Yud Beis. We are actually picking up at the Mishnah on Yud Aleph Amud Beis. The Mishnah says as follows: Ir sheyesh ba'avodas kochavim chutzala. So we'll say a very interesting case over here. Sorry. Ir sheyesh ba'avodas kochavim chutzala motor. If you have a city in which there was Avoda Zara. So remember again, what we've been focusing on this entire Masechta so far, is that when you have a city that is celebrating an Avoda Zara Yom Tiv, you can't engage in transactional activity with them. Why? Because any type of transactional activity can lead to their enhanced attachment or gratitude to Avoda Zara, in which case I am in some way facilitating or enabling or amplifying the worship of Avoda Zara. So now the Mishnah is getting into an interesting dynamic over here. What happens if you have a city that is in the middle of their Yom Tiv? So the Mishnah says, assuming that the city residents are the worshippers and the people living on the outskirts are not the worshippers, so halacha l'mais, you are allowed to transact business with the people living outside of the city. Take a look at Rashi. So Rashi says over here, so the case over here is The people of the city have a Yom Tov. They have a Yom Tov for their Avoda Zara. Look at the next Rashi. Chutza la mutter. Lo seis v'lo seis im hayoshin chutz la'ir. So you are allowed to transact business with those sitting outside of the city, those living outside of the city. Why? She'ein nimshachim achar osa avodas kochavim. Because interestingly enough, there were often two different communities between the people who lived in the city and the people who lived outside of the city. And often the people living inside of the city had one Avoda Zara, but the people living outside of the city were not necessarily part of that same framework of people. Shekein minag, ze oved eshalo, v'ze oved eshalo. Because the minhag of the Avoda Zara was what? This one worships his Avoda Zara. This one worships his Avoda Zara. V'yom iyad shel elu, eno b'yom iyad shel elu. And therefore, again, because they worship different idolatries, therefore, halacha l'mais, again, this one's Yom Tiv was not this one's Yom Tiv. By the way, I just want to point out something absolutely amazing. Here's like the fundamental difference between Ovdei Kochavim and Avoda Zara, right? But Oved Kochavim is understood. Look at the lashon of Rashi. Ze Oved Eshalo, Ze Oved Eshalo. The way it works by Avoda Zara is you have your God, I have my God. What's the beautiful part about Klal Yisrael? We all have one God. We all have one God. Now, we may worship Him in different ways, and we may observe different things, but Lamaisa, all roads lead back to one Ribono Shel Olam. That is the nitzchias, that is the strength ultimately of Klal Yisrael. So therefore, any event, the Mishnah says, so therefore, halacha Lamaisa, if let's say the townspeople are celebrating a Yom Tiv, I am permitted to transact business with the people outside of the city, again, assuming that I know that they don't worship the same Avoda Zara as the townspeople. Okay, the reverse is also true. Haya chutza la'avodas kochavim, tocha la'muter. Same idea. If the people on the outskirts are worshiping a Yom Tiv, right, they have a Yom Tiv, so I'm allowed to transact business with people inside of the city. Because again, all of this, of course, is predicated on the idea that I know this to be true. In other words, the Mishnah is not necessarily saying that you could automatically make this assumption. But again, it would be common for people inside of the city to be worshiping Avoda Zara or Yom Tiv, and the people on the outside not, or vice versa. Therefore, you can transact business with whoever is not celebrating an Avoda Zara Yom Tiv, and you don't have to be concerned that halacha l'maisa, they are nigrar, they are, I will call it theologically pulled or theologically following the people in close proximity. Okay, incredible. Next. The Gemara says, mutter, I'm sorry. Good. So we Gemara asked the following interesting question. What is the halacha? Assuming that a city is observing an Avoda Zara Yom Tiv, are you allowed to go ahead and go to that city, walk towards that city? If you look at Rashi says, so let's say, the city A has an idolatrous Yom Tiv that day. I happen to go because I know someone in that city. I want to talk to them about something. We're not transacting anything. There's no transactional. It's an acquaintance of mine. I want to say Shalom Aleichem. Can I go to the city when it's worshiping an Avoda Zara Yom Tiv? So the Gemara says, it depends. Bizman shahaderech miyuchedes la'osa makom aser. If the path that I'm taking only leads to that particular city, then ultimately, again, I'm not allowed to. But if the path happens to lead to various locations, and therefore, again, taking that road doesn't automatically mean that I'm headed to that city, then ultimately, again, it's going to be mutter. What's the pshat? Take a look at Rashi. Bizman shaderech miyuchedes la'osa makom, shein derech yotza me'osa ha'ir lilich li'ir acheres, v'derech ha'kvusha mikan la'osa ha'ir miyuchedes la'osa ha'ir levada, aser lilich sham, mipnei chashad, shenira kimahalech la'avda. So we'll say a Marasayan issue, and we'll discuss this more in the Gemara. The concern is like this. If the road to the city, it doesn't go anywhere else, only goes to that city. So the problem is, if I take that road, it looks like I'm going to worship Avoda Zara, even though it's clearly not my intent. I'm not worshiping Avoda Zara. I'm not doing any business with Ovdei Avoda Zara. Literally, I'm going to give a Shalom Aleichem. That's it. But the problem is taking that path. If people see me on that path, and that path only leads to one location, that city, and that city is worshiping an Avoda Zara, observing an Avoda Zara Yom Tiv that day, that's problematic. But if the path happens to go other places, so again, someone's seen me on that path, lav dafka, I'm headed to the city worshiping Avoda Zara. Maybe I'm going somewhere else, and therefore halacha l'maisa, it would be mutter. Incredible. All right, so that's the Mishnah. So Gemara says as follows: Hechi dami, hechi dami chutzala. So we'll say now the Gemara raised an interesting question over here. What is the definition of outskirts, right? The way the Mishnah was set up was like this. If you have a city and then people live on the outskirts of that city, just because the residents of the city are observing an Avoda Zara Yom Tiv doesn't automatically mean that the residents on the outside are observing the Yom Tiv. Now, what's the Chiddush? The Chiddush is that proximity does not automatically create a problematic scenario. That's the idea that the Mishnah is introducing to us, and all of that is based on the idea that it was common for people to have different Avodah Zaras, and because of that, it's not crazy to think that the people in the city are observing a Yom Tiv, and the people outside is not. So what the Gemara is really asking is like this: how close can you be? How close can you be and still work under the possibility that the residents on the outskirts are not observing the same Yom Tiv as the residents of the city? Look at Rashi for just a moment. So Rashi says over here, Hechi dami chutzala, kama yehe rachok osa shuk shechutzala min ha'ir v'yeh mutter lo seis v'lo seis im yoshav. So literally, how far, or really to say it differently, how close can it actually be for this dispensation to occur? So it's a pretty incredible Gemara. Amar Shimon Lakish Rabbi Chanina kigon atluza shel Aza. Just like Atluza of Aza, right? So again, it could be as close as Atluza is to Aza. So I'll just point out over here, by the way, we're not getting into it now, but there is a whole discussion in the Ma'arit about whether or not Aza is part of Eretz Yisrael, right? Does Aza have Kedushas Eretz Yisrael or not? So pretty amazing to be contemplating these Gemaras now. So what does this mean? Kigon Atluza shel Aza. Rashi says, look at Rashi. Atluza shel Aza. Atluza shuk shel behema. Kigo itliz. Disnan shochtin beitliz v'nim karim beitliz. So Rashi says, so good. So by the way, Rashi just points out over here, Atluza may or may not be like a specific name. Rashi says Atluza means ultimately an animal marketplace. So Atluza means a marketplace for animals that was outside of Aza. Rashi says Aza, Ir shel plishtim v'haya ba'avodas kochavim v'haya chutzala yishuv samoch le'ir ma'od. So there was a place called Aza. Once upon a time, there was a place called Aza. It was a Philistine city, right? And there was a lot of idol worshiping that was happening in there, right? It's not a new thing that, unfortunately, again, difficult things come out of Aza. So I'll say, so the mice again. So there was a place called Philistine city called Aza. There was Avoda Zara. Outside of Aza, there was this place called Atluza. So Atluza was in very close proximity to Aza. So we'll say what the Gemara seems to be saying is like this. So Reish Lakish is saying like this, that it could be as close as Atluza is to Aza. So Atluza literally was right outside of Aza, literally right outside of Aza, and ultimately, again, even in that close proximity, you could still, under certain circumstances, know that Atluza was not celebrating the same Yom Tov as Aza. Now, both say, in this version of the Gemara, Reish Lakish is saying it as a statement. In the Ikadamri, boy minei Rav Shimon Lakish me Rabbi Chanina. In the alternate version, it's not a statement, it's a question. What's the question? So the Gemara says, so Reish Lakish asks from Rabbi Chanina, Atluza shel Aza mahu. What is the status of Atluza outside of Aza? Is that too close? Or is that far enough, ultimately, again, to perhaps entertain the idea that Atluza does not celebrate the same Yom Tov as Aza itself? Amrlei. So again, so now in this second version, it's a question. In which case, Rabbi Chanina answers it. Amrlei. So the answer here is very interesting. He says, Lo halachta letzur miyamecha. Did you never go to the city of Tzur? So Rashi says over here, Tzur, Ir sheYisrael va'ovdei kochavim darin ba. So Tzur was a city where Jews and non-Jews lived side by side. So didn't you ever go to Tzur? And you would see a Jew and a non-Jew, top of your base. Sheshafsu kederos agabe kira achas. So Bosai, there's a lot of interesting statements that are being made over here, which we're going to kind of unravel in future sugyas as well. And if you went to Tzur, you would see something very interesting. Jews and non-Jews putting their pots on the same stove. V'lo chashu lahem chacham. The chachamim were not concerned The Chums were not concerned about this. Now, what would be that? What would the Chum be concerned about? Look at Rashi. Rashi is lo chashu chachamim afa pisha samoch iser etzel heter ma'od. So even though, again, obviously, you would think Jews and non-Jews cooking next to each other does not seem to be like a good idea. Yet, again, Rabbi Hanina says that the Chachamim were not concerned about that. In other words, they both say, now we're going to talk about actually a lot of these halachas and later on sugyas. What Rabbi Hanina is trying to highlight over here is that even close proximity does not cause a problem. So Rashi goes on, he says, Hachanami, afapi she'bnei ha'ir ha'asur and smuchel and mechutzala, she'in la'avodas kochavim hayom lo chashu. So too over here, even though Atluza is so close to Azah, it's not a problem. So again, Rabbi Hanina was trying to bring a raya that in the same way in Sur, Jews and non-Jews would often cook their pots of food, their respective pots of food on the same stovetop, right? And I guess they would have like these public stovetops, and the Chum were not concerned about the proximity. So too again, Atluza and Luz, even though they're, and Azah, even though they're so close to each other, if Azah was celebrating a Yom Tov of Avoda Zara, you could still transact business with Atluza. Okay? So the Gemara says, by the way, what does it mean the Chum were not concerned? They weren't concerned about what? So Amrabaye Mishum Basar Nevela. They weren't concerned about non-kosher meat. So the Gemara says, Lo Amrina and Dama Mahadra Ape Yisrael, Lachore, Vishade Avoda Oved Kochavim Nevela Bikdera. They weren't concerned about the following issue, that maybe the Jew is going to turn away from his pot for a moment, and the non-Jew is going to put a piece of non-kosher food in his pot, in the Jew's pot. So Chazal apparently, again, were not concerned about that. Rashi says, Mishum Basar Nevela, V'af Agav, Te'ika L'meicha Shleser D'Oraisa, so again, Chazal were not concerned that the Jew would turn away for a moment and that the non-Jew would place some type of non-kosher food in the Jew's pot. So too again, the Gemara says, the kavasa hachinami lo chashu lahem chachamim mishum demei avodas kochavim. So too over here, I will say, even though again, Atluza and Azah were so close to each other, nevertheless, again, Chazal were not concerned that if Azah was going ahead and celebrating a Yom Tov, that somehow that would trickle into Atluza. Now Rashi says over here, Hachanami lo mechaskinam demei avodas kochavim b'idei ovdei kochavim shebechutzala. You don't have to be concerned that maybe, right, in Atluza, they're getting money from Azah to purchase goods, and therefore if you sell to Atluza, ultimately, again, it's going to go to Azah for their Yom Tov. You don't have to be concerned about that. Proximity does not automatically create problem. Rava Amarava says, Milo Chasham Chacham. So I say, so now we're like a little bit caught up in this case of Tzur, right? Because in this case of Tzur, here's what we have. Jews and non-Jews were cooking their respective pots of foods together on a shared stovetop. And yet again, Rabbi Hanina said the rabbis were not concerned. So what they're trying to figure out is not concerned for what? So Rava says, Milo Chasham Chacham Mishum Bishule Ovdei Kochavim. Interesting. We weren't concerned because of Bishalakum. Now again, I want to point out all of these are Avodah Zara sugis. We're going to see all of this, right? What's Bishalakum? Bishalakum is you're not allowed to cook food or eat food, that was cooked by a non-Jew. Now, what the definition of that is, what the scope of that is, how to avoid that, we'll see this entire sugi in this Gemara, not in this Gemara, but in this Masechta. So Rava says they were not concerned about Bishalakum, which makes sense. In other words, you have a Jew and non-Jew cooking their respective pots of food on the same stovetop. Perhaps I should be concerned about the Gentile cooking the Jew's food. Rava says we're not concerned about that. The Gemara says, Hachanami lo chashu chachamim mishum yom edam. So too over here. So what do you see from here? Proximity doesn't cause a problem. So too again, even though Atluza and Azah were so close to each other, the proximity does not cause a problem. Rabba bar Ula amar lo chashulam chachamim mishum tzinura. So this is very interesting. Rabbi bar Ula says, no. What does it mean when it says that the rabbis in Sur were not concerned about Jews and non-Jews cooking their respective pots of food on the same stovetop? They weren't concerned because of splashage, splashing, right? Or just splashing, right? Good, right? So they weren't concerned because of splash, which makes sense. Two people, right? Jew and non-Jew cooking food in close proximity to each other. Perhaps we should have to be concerned because of splashing from one pot to the other. Kamashwan, they were not concerned about. So remember, all of these things highlight the same yesod, which is proximity does not automatically create a problem. And remember again, that was the whole yesod of our Mishnah. You have a city that's worshiping Avoda Zara, the outskirts don't automatically become prohibited because it's possible that the outskirts are not celebrating the same Yom Tov. The shaila is, how close can you be without causing a problem? So the Gemara wanted to suggest even like Atluza, Ta'aza. And now the Gemara is just bringing a raya that proximity doesn't create a problem from this case in Sur. So the Gemara says, so Rabbi Ula says in Sur, they're allowed to cook their pots on their respective, on the same stovetop, or not concerned because of splashing. The Gemara says, Hachanami, the Kavasak, Hachanami lo chashalam chachamim lifnei idein. So to over here, the Chamor, we're not concerned because of the proximity of Atluza to Aza. And I will say again, that's how the Gemara ultimately ends off, that halacha l'maisa, even something as close as Atluza and Aza will not be problematic. Now, I will say, obviously, all of this presupposes that halacha l'maisa, you know this to be true, right? In other words, you have to know this to be correct, that the two we'll call it the two cities or the two adjoining areas are not worshiping the same Avodah Zarah. In other words, the Gemara is not suggesting that you can make this assumption. The Gemara just says that if you know this to be true, then even though the city that is not celebrating is in such close proximity to the city that is celebrating, halacha l'mais, you can transact with the chevra that is not celebrating. Incredible. Okay, let's go back there. So mahu leilech l'sham. So the next case in the Mishnah was, if you have a city that's worshiping Avodah Zara, so halacha l'maisa, can you go to that city on the day of their Yom Tiv? So what did the Mishnah say? It depends. If the road only leads to that city, and that city is worshiping Avodah Zara, then you cannot go because it's Marasai, looks like you're going. If the road leads elsewhere, then you can go. So the Gemara says, Tanrabanan, Ir sheyesh ba'avodas kochavim, Asr likanes l'socha, v'lo misocha li'irach harastev Rabbi Meir. So this is very interesting halacha. So now the Brisa says like this: a city that is worshiping Avodah Zara, so halacha l'maisa, you cannot go into that city on the day of their Yom Tiv, and not from that city on your way to another city. These are the words of Rabbi Meir. The Chum say, Kol zman shaderech miyuchedes la'osa makom, ein haderech miyuchedes. I'm sorry, Asr. So we'll say, so a very interesting machlokes over here, right? So the Rabbi Meir says that halacha l'maaseh, any time a city is worshiping a Yom Tiv, you can't go in there. You're just not allowed. You're just not allowed to go in there. And ultimately, again, you can't even use that city as a way to get to another city. The Chum say everything is dependent on the highway, right? On the road that you're taking. If the road that you're taking only leads to to the city that's worshiping Avodah Zara, you can't take it you can't take it. If the road, however, leads to multiple different locations, then halacha l'maisa, you can take it. Okay, so I will say, so now, the Gemara, Pashtos, what this sounds like over here is a maris ayin issue, right? Of engaging in an activity. Now again, what's my intention? My intention is pure. Right, my intention is pure. I'm going to say Shalom Aleichem to someone. I'm going to just take a spatzir, whatever it is, right? But because my actions look suspect, therefore I am not permitted. That's what it sounds like is happening over. Therefore, I'm not permitted to do that. So what the Gemara does now is the Gemara introduces a whole bunch of other cases that fall into that same category. For example, Yoshev lo kotz b'fnei avodas kochavim. Interesting case. I'm standing in front of an idol, and what happens? I get a thorn in my foot. So what does the Gemara say? Lo yishcha v'yitlenen b'bnei shnira ki mishtacha al avodas kochavim. You can't bend down and take out the thorn. Why? Because it looks like I'm bowing down to idolatry. Right? So again, obviously, even though that is not my intention, I'm taking the thorn out of my foot. But I can't bend down. I can't bend down to take out the thorn because it looks like I'm worshiping. Okay. The Gemara says, "V'im einonir mutar." But ultimately, again, if for some reason, if somehow I could go ahead and take out the thorn, and ultimately, again, not have it look like I'm worshiping Avodah Zara, then it would be mutar. Another case, I dropped my money. And my money scattered in front of the Avodah Zara. What's the halacha? Lo yishcha v'yitleim. Don't bend down and gather up your money. Why? Ultimately, again, because it looks like I am bowing down to Avoda Zara. Vim eino nira, but again, if I could gather up my money without it looking like I'm bowing down, then ultimately mutter. Next, Mayon hamoshech lifnei avodas kochavim. Interesting case. Let's say there's a fountain, or Mayon actually means like a spring. There's a spring that's flowing in front of an avodah zara. Lo yishcha v'yishta. Don't bend it over and go ahead and drink from the fountain. Why? Makes sense, because it looks like I'm bowing down and worshiping idolatry. But again, ultimately, if somehow I could go ahead and bend down in a way that doesn't look like I'm worshiping Avoda Zara, then ultimately mutter. Next, Birtzufos Hamakalchin Maimakrachin. Suppose it's an interesting case over here. In this case, you have like statues, right? And the statue, you see this, right? The statue, it's like a fountain, and the water comes out of the mouth of the statue. So how would you normally go ahead and drink from the statue? You'd put your mouth right by the mouth of the statue. So the Gemara says, Lo yaniach piv al piem. Don't put your mouth on the mouth of the statue, because it looks like ultimately, again, you are kissing Avodah Zara. All right. Next, Lo yaniach piv al silon. Don't put your mouth on a pipe. Right. That's solid advice. Right? Don't put your mouth on a pipe, and drink, because of danger. I wasn't know what's the danger. So fine. So we'll get the Gemara. We'll explain all this in just a moment. So let's unravel this a little bit. So the Gemara says, "My eino nira." So we'll say, so here's the shaila, right? So essentially, there's a common denominator over here, right? Whether it's the thorn, whether it's the money, whether it's the mayon. In all of these cases, I need to bend down, either to take out the thorn, gather up my money, or to take a drink of water, right? And in all of these cases, what did Gemara say? Don't do it, because it looks like you're going to be worshiping Avodah Zara. But however, if you can go ahead and essentially bend down in a way that doesn't look like you're worshiping, that you're prostrating, that you're bowing to Avodah Zara, then you're fine. So the Gemara says, so let's analyze this. What does that mean if you could bend down in a way that doesn't look like you're worshiping Avodah Zara? Ilema de lo mischazi. So we'll say this is very interesting. If it means just quite literally bend down, so we'll say, right, you could see this, right? You could see, like, I don't know, I have a thorn in my foot. So instead of just like bowing down to the Avodah Zara, I don't know, I turn around, right? Or I kind of go sideways a little bit. So the Gemara says, Ilim de lo mischazi. See if it means that at the end of the day, it's not going to look like you're bowing down. Rashi says over here, right? Lo mischazi shein adam ro'ehu. So Rashi understands over here means like this: if I look around and there's no one else around, which means no one's going to see me bowing down, and I know I'm not worshiping Avodah Zara. I'm just taking the thorn out of my foot, gathering up my money, and no one else is around to see me. The Gemara says, this is fascinating. The Gemara says that it doesn't help. Why not? V'amar Rabbi Yehuda Amarav. Oh, Rabbi say this is a tremendous sugya. Anytime the Gemara suggests over here as follows. The Gemara says, anytime that something is asur because of marasayin. I will say, now, okay, a word about marasayin. I'll just point out also, Tosfos quotes that this statement over here, which the Gemara just puts down as a declarative statement, is actually a massive machlokes. But let's just talk about this just literally again for 5 seconds. What is marasayin? Right, so marasayin abosai means, again, engaging in an activity that is 100% unequivocally mutter. But what's the problem? It looks asur. So Chazal said, you're not allowed to do it. So the shaila is, why is maris ayin asur? This is an interesting idea. Why is maris ayin asur? So there's two possibilities. Number one is that people may see what I'm doing, not understand the nuances of what I'm doing, think that I'm doing one thing and assume that it's mutter. So for example over here, right, I'm bowing down or I'm bending over to take the thorn out of my foot. Reuven walks by, and what does he see? He sees me bowing down to an idol. He's like, oh, well, Silber's a pretty decent guy. I guess if he's bowing down to an idol, I guess it's okay for me as well. So someone else may learn from my activity. That's possibility one. Possibility two is that no, maris ayin is a din in v'yisem nikiyim. It has nothing to do with other people seeing anything. It has to do with me. My actions have to be beyond reproach. And my actions should never need an explanation. The moment your actions require Rashi, is the moment that there's a problem, right? And therefore, again, Maris Ayin says, Nabosai, what's the nafkamina? And therefore, again, don't do anything that requires any level of explanation. What's the nafkamina between those two approaches? Whether or not there's anyone else around. According to the first approach, Maris Ayin is really only problematic if other people see, if there's the potential for someone else to see it. But if there's no one else around, there's no Maris Ayin. According to the second approach, no. Maris Ayin is problematic all the time because of the Yisem Nikiyim. So the Gemara is suggesting over here, it sounds like over here that the Gemara really subscribes to the second approach, which is that halacha l'maisa, whether people are around or not, anything that is usher because of Maris Ayin, you can't do. So therefore, according to that, whether people could see me or not see me doesn't make any difference. So back to the Gemara. So the Gemara says as follows. So the Gemara says, rather, the Gemara says, you're right. What it actually means is like this. What it actually means is like this. That halacha l'maisa, that if you could bow, what the Gemara is saying is this: if the only way to take out this thorn, to retrieve this money, is to do it in a way that looks like you're worshiping the idol, that's problematic. But if halacha l'maisa, you could bend over in a way that doesn't look like you're bowing to the idol, then that's going to be mutter. So the Gemara says, okay, now that makes a lot more sense. Because then halacha l'maisa, again, I'm not getting into any kind of maras ayin issue over here. If I could avoid the appearance of worship, avoid the appearance of bowing and prostration, then ultimately, again, it is mutter to engage in all of these activities. So the Gemara says, okay, so now, what's the Avi Shaila? Why do you need to illustrate this concept with so many different examples? Which the Gemara says, I'll tell you why. The Tana quotes, Mishum de Afshalam Ezel Kameo Mishkale. So I'll say, so I would say like this. I'll tell you why. Had it just said the case of the thorn, so the truth is, I'll say the thorn case is actually a little bit easier. Why? Because even though I have a thorn on my foot and it's painful, hop over a little bit, right? Hop over a couple of steps, get out of proximity of the Avoda Zara, and then take out the thorn, right? Then take out the thorn. However, again, the Gemara says, Aval mos delo efshar emalo. But it's possible, again, the money, right? The money, where if the money spilled in a way where I can't move over, I have to collect it over here, perhaps I would have said that bowing down even in a little bit of an abnormal way to get the money would have been aser. V'tana mos, and had it just said the case of the money, that's going to be aser. Why dimamona? Because ultimately, again, it's just money. Aval coats Zara, but ultimately, again, coats, right? But the thorn, which is mamish, like physical pain, I might have thought that again, halacha l'maisa, it would not be problematic, right? Ultimately, again, I would have been okay for me to go ahead and bow down because, again, I'm not going ahead and bowing down to the elbows. I'm taking out the thorn. V'tana hani tartin. If we would have just said these first two, namely the thorn and the money, mishum deleka sakana, because ultimately, again, there's no danger involved there, and that's why you can't bow down to take out the thorn and to retrieve the money. Avamayon. When it comes to the spring, now again, it's a spring is water. I need water to live. Di'ika sakana. Perhaps it's talking about a case of sakana, of danger. Di'i lo shasi mais. If I don't drink, chas shalom, I could die. Emalo. Perhaps there is not a problem, ultimately, again, to just bow down. Since in all these cases, my intention is not to worship. Maybe I could bow down to get a drink of water. Therefore, tzricha. Therefore, the Gemara needs to add in that case to tell me that that case is problematic as well. I will say Bezim Beis 12b. The Gemara says Pirtsufos lamali. So okay, so therefore, why do I need the case? So therefore, I'm going to say this. That's why I need all of those cases. So we're just going case by case. I need the case of thorn. I need the case of money. I need the case of the spring. Pirtsufos lamali. So why do I need the case ultimately again of? Remember, what was the case of the Pirtsufos? This was the statue fountain, right? Where again, the water comes out of the mouth of the statue. But again, if you're trying to teach me about water, you taught me about water in the previous case of Mayon. So why do I need this case of the Pirtsufos? So the Gemara says, Lamali, Mishum de Kabai lemisni kiyotse bo lo yaniach piv al gabe silon v'yishta mipnei asakana. So interestingly enough, because the reason they introduced the Pirtsufos case is actually not because of its Avoda Zara importance, because that was already covered by the Mayan case. It was actually the Pirtsufos case was just ultimately, again, the entry to the second case of drinking out of a pipe. Don't drink out of a pipe. Why? Because of sakana. causes sakana. Interesting. So also I point out over here, if you look at Tosa, actually Tosa just points out, it says Pirtzufo, it's just interesting, it's the Afagav, the Menashek Lavodas Kochavim, Eino Chomer Kimishtachava. So we'll say, this is fascinating. He says, kissing Avoda Zara is not as chomer as bowing down to it, which sounds totally counterintuitive, but actually makes a lot of sense. Why? Because we'll say, in the world of Avoda Zara, remember again, we'll get into this, there are different forms of worshiping certain types of Avoda Zara, but yet there are certain universal forms of worship that are asur for every type of Avoda Zara. So for example, prostration is one of those. So prostration is actually considered to be like the core form of worship. Okay, so therefore the Gemara says you're right. The case of drinking water out of the mouth of the Avoda Zara statue was actually a little bit superfluous, but it was only there because it introduced the second case of don't put your mouth on a pipe and drink from a pipe because of sakana. Okay, now the Gemara says, by the way, what's the sakana? What danger are we talking about over here? Aluka. So it's interesting enough, the Gemara says the sakana over here is ultimately, again, leeches. Now, before we go on, take a look at Rashi. The Gabi Mayon, the second Rashi, this is 3 lines down in Rashi. Gabi Mayon Tana, right? Shechia velo Tana hanochas peh. Right? Interestingly enough, by the spring case, right? So the spring case was talking about bowing down. Because remember, the spring is in front of the Avoda Zara. I'm bowing down to drink out of the spring. And there was no discussion about placing your mouth on something. Hilchach lo shayach lemisni kiyotze bo gabe. Aval bepertsufos tana hanochas peh. By the case of the statues, remember again, the way the Gemara set up the case of the statues is, don't put your mouth right on the mouth of the statue. And therefore, again, the same way you can't put your mouth on the statue, don't put your mouth on the pipe. Because we're going to see, I'll say, by the pipe, the sakana is only when you drink out of the pipe. Putting your hand under the pipe and catching the water and drinking like that, that's not going to be a problem. Okay, so back to the Gemara now. What's the problem ultimately, again, with drinking out of the pipe? Leeches, right? So the concern over here is if you put your mouth on the pipe, you're drinking right out of the pipe, you don't see what's coming out of the pipe, you may ingest a leech, and that apparently could be a fatal thing. Okay, so turn up on us. So I'll say, so now let's analyze. Now the Gemara kind of digresses a little bit to speak a bit more about this sakana of drinking out of pipes. So turn up on lo yishta adamayim. Lo mina naros v'lo mina agomim. Person should not drink water out of the rivers or out of the marshes. Lo befiv v'lo biyado achas. Not by mouth. In other words, don't drink directly with your mouth, which means like putting your mouth to the body of water, and not with one hand. Now what's the chap with one hand? This is very interesting. Biyado achas mimaher v'zorek befiv ve'eno bodek. I will say, when you're scooping out water with, it's very interesting, you're scooping out water with one hand, so what happens? Because obviously I can't hold that much in my hand, person drinks it quickly, and they don't examine what exactly is in their hand. But with your 2 hands, when you scoop up water with 2 hands, ultimately you have a bit more of a receptacle, right? And halacha l'maisa, you could look at what's in your hand and to detect whether or not there's any problematic substances in the water. Very profound. Ultimately, we'll say, by the way, there's a tremendous Musar Haskell in that also. The difference between doing something with one hand versus 2 hands, right? One hand representing a bit more haphazard activity versus 2 hands representing a bit more thoughtful and concrete activity. When you do things with one hand, generally, again, it's sloppier, not as well thought out, and a person doesn't have the opportunity to examine their work. Which again represents those things that we do in life that are a bit more haphazard and half-hearted. When we do things with 2 hands, which means that we are devoting ourselves to the task at hand, that we are attentive, that we are engaged, then ultimately, again, we are so much more embedded in what it is that we do, and the results are so much better. So the Gemara goes weiter. The Gemara says, Vim shaso, and if you go ahead and you drink water like this, damo barosho, Ultimately, again, your blood is on your head, which means you're responsible for whatever happens to you. So the Gemara says, okay, so let's analyze. So now the Gemara says, remember, this whole brisa was, you can't drink water from rivers or from marshes, not either directly with your mouth. In other words, you can't put your mouth to the river, or you can't drink with one hand. Why? Because of sakana. The Gemara says now, my sakana saluka. It was a fear or a sakana, ultimately, again, of leeches. So the Gemara said, so this seems to support ultimately again Rabbi Chanina's statement. What's Rabbi Chanina's statement? Dam Rabbi Chanina. Now again, I just want to point out. Remember, this is a very, very specific case over here of like bending down to the water and drinking straight from the water, or one-handed drinking. The whole yesod is everything is happening quickly. There's no time to examine what it is that you're scooping up. So obviously, if a person, like Tosas points out, a person's taking it out in a kli, or Rashi pointed out, two hands, this concern does not apply. So the Gemara says, so it's very interesting. If a person swallows, we'll say Nema Shamayim is a leech, a water leech. If a person goes, Rashi says, Shehi Aluka, Nema Shehi Aluka, person swallows a water leech. So this is very interesting. Mutar lahachem lo chamin b'Shabbos. You're allowed to heat up water for them on Shabbos. Now, what does that mean? Look at Rashi. Lahachem lo mayim chamim lishtos b'Shabbos. The sakanas nefashas hi kediktani bebraisa dama b'rosho. Shabbos says, so apparently ingesting a leech is like not pashat, right? And it's mamish sakanas nefashas. So the point that Allah l'mayis, you can be mechal Shabbos for such a person. So a person went ahead and ingested a leech on Shabbos. So halacha, you can literally go ahead and heat up water for them in order to save their life. And there was a mice like this. Once the story of a guy who swallowed a water leech. Rabbi Nechemia literally allowed him to go ahead, and Rabbi Nechemia allowed to heat up water on Shabbos. So the Gemara says, now again, here's what's interesting. If you look at Rashi says over here, no, sorry, not yet. So we'll say, so now what's interesting to note is, obviously you're allowed to heat up water for someone on Shabbos. Now heating up water, of course, takes time. So now, interesting enough, the Gemara says, Adahachi v'hachi, while you're going ahead and heating up the water, the Gemara says, Amrafun B'Rei Yeshua, ligma chala. Have the person go ahead and swallow strong vinegar. So apparently vinegar goes ahead and I guess prevents the effects of the leech from progressing, buys you some time until the water goes ahead and heats up, and then you're able to drink the water. Okay, incredible. Rashi said, "Dahaki v'haki b'such zman shemechamin lo hamayim yashku chometz shelo yimaher lamos." So again, while the water is heating up, halacha l'maisa, go ahead and have him drink some vinegar in order that he stays off the effects of the leech. Incredible. I will say, I just point out also, this is fascinating, just also like the most Haskell in these things also, that sometimes this vinegar versus hot water dynamic. The hot water apparently is the cure. The vinegar is the thing that goes ahead and keeps the effects of the leech from progressing too dramatically. So in life, I think it's tremendous metaphor for life as well, that often in life we have our leech problems, right? What are our leech problems? Our leech problems are the things that really, if they're not addressed, will be our undoing, right? There are different types of problems we have in life. There are certain smaller issues that I have that although I need to tackle it, I could still progress in life relatively well, even with these problems. And then there are other life challenges that I have that really, if they're not addressed, they could pull the rug out from under me and really prevent me from progressing in life and accomplishing anything. Those bigger problems need to be addressed. But sometimes the solution that they need, which is the hot water, the solution that they need are a little bit further off. In life, it's important to figure out what are the short-term steps that I could take to help alleviate the bigger problems, even though those short-term steps will not go ahead and totally solve my bigger life issues, but they kind of like triage. They prevent the bigger life issues from spiraling out of control. That's my vinegar Band-Aids. So many big issues in life require vinegar Band-Aids that just triage the issue for now. It's not going to solve the problem. I need my hot water solutions. But it takes time for water to heat up. So before you get your big, what we'll call hot water solution, I need my vinegar Band-Aids in life. And I will say, this is so important because a lot of times we struggle with things like this. Big issues which I know I need to solve in my life, but the solution is not readily available in front of me right now. That's my hot water. It's on the stovetop. It's heating up. I know what I need to do. I know that I need to get there. But then there are intermediate vinegar steps that I need to take now in order to ensure that the situation does not spiral further out of control. Such a Musar Haskell. So the Gemara goes right there. The Gemara says, I'm not fooling about Yeshua. So this is very interesting. So the Gemara says, so what happens if a person swallows a bee? So what's the halacha? Ultimately, again, a person like this is not going to survive. So apparently, this was a fatal thing. So the Gemara says, Rashi says over here, Rashi says zibura tsira. So tsira literally is a hornet. Right? So a person swallows a hornet, they're not going to live. So the Gemara says, Miu lishkaye rivi asa dechala shamgaz efshar dechaye purta ad mafkida beisei. Such a strong Gemara. So the Gemara says, however, what should you do? The Gemara says, at least drink some strong vinegar because that will delay the fatal effects of the swallowed hornet, which will at least buy you a little bit of time to leave final instructions to your family. To your family. But let's say it's all tremendous Musar Haskell also, right? What's the Musar Haskell in this? Well, besides don't swallow a hornet, right? But Lamaisa, also the other Musar Haskells will say sometimes in life there are realities from which we cannot escape, right? There are realities again that you can't change the outcome. It is going to be what it's going to be. Even in those situations, it is so important to optimize the circumstances you have. Right? There are times in life where I could change the circumstances, times in life where I can't change the circumstances. You swallow a hornet, the Gemara says, things are going in one direction. So what do you do if you swallow a hornet? At least optimize the circumstances you have. Drink a little bit of strong vinegar, buy yourself some extra time, at least give last will and instructions to your family. If you can change your circumstances, great. If you can't, optimize the ones that you have. Such incredible musaska that Chazal give us, even in the most seemingly mundane Gemaras. Let's go back there. Tana Abanan. Lo yishta adamayim balayla. This was an interesting case as well over here. Person should not drink water at night. Now, why not? Now, we're going to see over here, say this is an issue of shadim. This was an issue of shadim. Now, the issue of Rosa over here is as follows. Remember, we've seen this before, that there were shadim that often would hover over liquids. We've seen this concept before. And especially at night, the assumption is if I'm alone, in other words, if I'm getting up to drink water at night, b'pashtos, that is a solitary activity. And therefore, again, being alone at night puts me more susceptible to shaitan to begin with. And if you drink water at night, ultimately, again, you're responsible for taking your own life. So the Gemara says, my sakana, what's the sakana? Sakana's shavriri. That is the sakana of shavriri. So we'll say this is a shade. Rashi says over here, shavriri, shade hamamuna amaka sanbeirin. So apparently this shade has the power over blindness. So fine. So we'll say, so therefore again, don't drink water alone at night. Vitzachi, my takanti. But what if I'm thirsty? So what should I do then under that circumstance? So the Gemara says, my takante, iika achrina bahade, lisirei. So again, if there's someone else with you, wake them up. Rashi says, lisirei yakitzenu mishnasa v'leima leit sachina maya. So wake them up and say, hey, I'm thirsty. Now, by the way, I just want to point out something very interesting. The Rishonim bring down, if it's your wife, don't do it, right? Don't do it. Why? Because better to take your chances with shavriri, right, than waking up your wife because you are thirsty at night. So the Gemara says again, Lisrei, what did you say? So wake someone else up and say, I'm thirsty. Vilo. So let's say again, there's no one else that you're going to take a risk and wake up. So the Gemara says, Vilo, Nikarkish benechamta achatzba. Rattle the lid of the water jug. Rattle the lid of the water jug. Now we'll say now why? Because ultimately you can remember, shadim don't like noise, right? Shadim don't like noise. And Abba say, Rashi points out over here, right? Nikarkish benechamta yikashkish bekisei hama achatzba ala chatzav the lidmi ki gavra behadei. Because we'll say essentially, when you make noise, the shadim think that it's more than one person. And remember again, shadim only attack the vulnerable, and vulnerability ultimately is when we are alone. So therefore, again, if there's noise, the shade is going to assume that there are other people around, and therefore again is going to leave me alone. So go ahead and shake the top of the lid, the lid of the utensil, and say the following thing. Planya bar planisa. That's you, right? Insert your name here. Planya ben Planisa, right? Your name, the son of your mother, right? Amrlach imech azdar mishavriri periri riri yiri ri bekasich yiri. And again, say the following words. Say the following words, right? So your name, the son of your mother's name, that your mother told you. Be careful with shavriri. And then what do you do with the name? You break down the name into smaller and smaller parts. Bekasichiri, in white cups. What is this? Rashi says over here, is dar mishavriri shavriri biriri riri yiri ri bekasichiri. Rashi says, lachashu. This is like an incantation. Umisma'it v'holech, and the idea is you take the name of the shade and you break it down into smaller parts. Mishuma shade kasher hu shamea miut tevus os achar os. When the shade hears its name broken down into smaller components, letter after letter, ad ri v'chinu alachash levricho misham. So apparently, again, Rabbi said the way to scare the shade off is to diminish its name into smaller and smaller parts. So if you go ahead, so there's a couple of things happening over here. You're rattling the lid of the water jug. Therefore, again, making the shade think that you are not alone. There are other people. If there's other people there, the shade is not going to attack. You also go ahead and you diminish the name of the shade into smaller and smaller letters until you get shavriri, gets all the way to ri. And ultimately, again, the shade will disappear. Again, I will say, like all Gemaras we see with shadim, right? So what do we do? What do we do with these Gemaras? What do we do with these Gemaras? So ultimately, again, I will say, so again, there's a fundamental machlokes about what to do with any of these Gemaras with shadim. Is this literal? Is it metaphorical? Clearly, again, Chazal felt it deserved to be included in Shas. Obviously, it's something. And of course, the Musar Haskell to us is there are definitely dynamics in this world that we do not see, dynamics in this world that we do not understand. Just because we don't understand something, comprehend something, doesn't mean it doesn't exist in some way. The Maharal, of course, is of the approach that in general, any discussion of shadim is much more metaphorical. It's not to be taken literally, in which case, again, there's a Musar Haskell to be gleaned from each of these Gemaras. And I will say, the idea over here is, there's plenty of Musar Haskell to be gleaned from this as well, but Lamais will stop over here for today, 6:43 already. Okay, I should have paced myself a little bit better to do with this Gemara. But I will say that again, tremendous sugya. We'll stop over here for today, pick up with the Mishnah tomorrow. Shkayach, everyone. I will say, just a reminder, Louis Kaplan is sitting Shiva this morning, 3112 Hatton. Minyan begins Emir Hashem at 6:50 a.m. If you could help make the minyan, that'd be tremendous. Mincha Ma'ariv there is in 6:50 is Plag, 6:55 p.m. as well. All right, Zoom. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.